Excellent. Well, we're 1 minute past now, and very warm welcome to everyone in joining today's global virtual webinar on the International Public Sector Accounting Standards Board's inaugural Sustainability Reporting Standard, SRS 1, in its exposure draft form focused on climate-related disclosures. My name is Alex Metcalfe. I'm a principal consultant with the IPSASB. I'm very pleased to be joined today by Karen Leung, who is manager of the IPSASB as well. And together we'll be taking you through a discussion on this first sustainability reporting standard by the board, focused on climate-related disclosures. And in doing that, we want to make sure that we get a really robust interaction with everyone who's joining us today. So if you're able to, please do make full use of the Q&A function that's available within the Zoom platform. You're also going to see a set of interactions as we move through the content today, and that's going to be hosted on Slido. So in a moment, you'll be seeing a QR code coming up on screen, where as we go through the different elements of the exposure draft, we'll then briefly stop for a moment to hear from all of you. So if you're able to, at this point, bring up your smartphones and make use of that Slido QR code, there isn't anything that you need to download. It just takes you to a regular landing page on your typical browser. And you'll be able to provide us with instant feedback on this exposure draft. That's going to be really important for the board's upcoming deliberations on SRS ED 1. So do make use of that. You'll see the QR code in a few other instances as well. But all we need from you here is to insert your name and then be able to provide the feedback as we make our way through today's discussion. And with that, let's maybe test the Slido functionality. And that's actually just to give everyone an opportunity to let us know where you're coming from. So if you could make use of that QR code and the link there to then let us know what best describes your role in joining our discussion today. So are you a preparer of either public sector sustainability reports or maybe broader preparation work within the public sector, a standard setter working in an accounting firm or an audit, representing an IFAC member body, so a professional accountancy organization, or a user of public sector sustainability reports? So many different options here to see what's coming through strongly. Lots of other, so interesting to see what might be represented in there. Feel free to make use of chat or the Q&A to let us know what other categories might be represented in today's audience. But really useful to see. So we have quite a few who are preparers then, Karen, who are joining us, as well as a quite large, plurality of individuals who are citing other as the most important one there.
Great to see a lot of participation in this first Slido.
Yeah, really, really good news to see that. So thank you very much, everyone, for successfully testing Slido as we make our way in today's discussion. So in terms of what we're looking to cover then, with that really useful context now in place, I'd like to set out really first for you some initial context and background on what brought the IPSASB to the position today of issuing this inaugural sustainability reporting standard in its exposure draft form as a standard that is fit for the public sector. Between us then, so between Karen and myself, we're also then going to highlight some of the key proposals that are found within this exposure draft to give you more of an in-depth sense of the work of the IPSASB, some of its thinking, and what's brought us to this ED stage. And we're going to have a number of opportunities for intervention, making use of Slido again, but also at the end of today's presentation, I'm really pleased that we have the Q&A function available to everyone. So do make full use of that. Karen and I might not be able to come to those questions immediately as we're presenting that specific content, but we have allocated some time at the end to make sure that we do engage with that Q&A function as well. So if there's anything that comes up in your own mind as we're making our way through this content, please feel free to engage with the Q&A box that you see along the ribbon on the bottom of your screen on the Zoom platform. Excellent. Okay, so let's focus on the project background itself then. Start with that, where this is just a useful bit of context in understanding what's brought the IPSASB to the position now of issuing SRS ED 1. And if I take you back about 3 years now to a World Bank report that was issued in January of 2022. You'll see there on the left-hand side this report on sovereign climate and nature reporting. And this report had a number of really important insights that came forward, but of particular relevance to the IPSASB was a specific call on the board to consider its role and to start to develop sustainability reporting standards that are fit for the public sector. And the World Bank report noted that there's been significant progress on the private sector or corporate reporting that's happening in terms of climate and also broader sustainability. A lot of that being led by the International Sustainability Standards Board in developing a global baseline of sustainability reporting disclosures. But at the same time, the World Bank had identified a significant gap in this reporting landscape. And that was in terms of the sovereign entities or the public sector entities who play really important roles in the economy, doing that in terms of their sovereign powers, if that's as a regulator or the legislative powers that they're making use of, or even some of the policy decisions they might be making in terms of how they tax, subsidize, or influence behavior. And at the same time, when the World Bank was assessing the capital markets, looking at particularly the bond markets, they noted that around 40% of the bond markets globally were represented by sovereigns, by public sector issued debt. So if we're seeing an increase in the availability of information from private sector disclosures, but not a comparable increase in the reporting coming through from governments, that's going to create an asymmetry of information for those investors who are participating within those bond markets. So different ways in which the World Bank was calling on the IPSASB to step up and to fill that information gap to support users in their decision making and also in support around accountability of some of the public policy powers that certain public sector entities have. This then brought us along to the initial consultation that the IPSASB issued in May of 2022. So a fairly rapid response that was coming from the IPSASB, setting out what they saw as their potential role in developing public sector sustainability reporting standards. And this was a consultation issued in May of 2022, running through until September of that same year, which suggested that the IPSASB could undertake a similar function as it had for many years in applying its due process of transposing the work of the IFRS Foundation, the IFRS standards, to from a private sector context to a public sector context. And that existing network expertise and due process could then be extended from the financial reporting element into sustainability reporting. There was also some consideration in this consultation around what could be some of the first projects that the board might consider, looking particularly at climate-related disclosures and the general disclosure requirements. So that's S2 and S1 under the ISSB. And there was also, I think really importantly, an acknowledgement by the board and the responses from constituents that there was a real need for haste and an urgency in the development of these standards, given that, one, we're seeing a climate crisis take place, but we're also at the same time seeing a broader set of sustainability challenges that are rapidly unfolding around the world. And that we can't be in a position where governments are requiring some of these disclosures by private sector, or often in the value chains of the public and private sector, who would then be asked for this information in certain circumstances, but who are sitting on the back foot and not providing these disclosures themselves. So there's a real call from constituents in terms of the need to develop real urgency around the development of these sustainability reporting standards for the public sector. But of course, in the response that came back on this consultation paper, there were a number of key issues that constituents raised. The first of these that I'd like to spend a moment on is considering the need for sustainability expertise within the IPSASB and its broader network of exceptional volunteers and the staff as well. So if we move on to the next slide for that, Actually, no, sorry. Before we do that, we have another poll, don't we, Karen? Yeah, you've just brought that up.
Yeah.
And that's to ask for all of those joining in today. Do you agree that there's actually a need for public sector specific sustainability reporting standards? So from what I've set out for you today, in terms of that background that's brought us to the place of developing this first exposure draft, what's the view of this international group where it would be great to hear your views on the need for public sector specific sustainability reporting standards. Great to see responses coming in.
I see a lot of yeses, but there's also some nos. Really interesting to see why you think there wouldn't be a need for public sector specific sustainability reporting standards.
Yeah, excellent. I think that's coming through pretty consistently now. So we're getting something like 9 out of 10 saying that there is that need. Yeah, there
Yeah.
we are. And a pretty good response rate coming through from everyone. So thank you very much for participating in this first substantive poll. Excellent. We got still a few more coming in, but we're really kind of sitting. I think we've got our marker in this end there, I think, Karen. So I'm not sure. I can't remember. Do we have a quick follow up on this one, Karen, for any additional insights on anyone who's answered no?
Some additional insights through our other questions.
Okay. All right. Well, for anyone who did, if you have strong opinions on either the yes or the no, do feel free to make use of the chat function there as well to let us know if there's a particular rationale that you'd have around why you feel there should or should not be public sector specific sustainability reporting standards. Do feel free to make use of that chat function. So if we can move on then to the next
Yep.
slide. And that'll bring us to some of the considerations we have on addressing the set of stakeholder priorities that we heard from the consultation. And in undertaking that consultation, that did lead the board towards the next step in giving you this background, which is that the board stepped up to do some research and scoping to fully understand their potential role within the sustainability reporting landscape. And that was running through the tail end of 2022 into 2023, where the focus was on 3 potential priority projects for this research and scoping phase, looking at both IFRS S1 and S2, so the general disclosure requirements, as well as the climate-related disclosures under the IPSASB standards. And in addition to that, the board spent time reflecting on the important area of natural resources and biodiversity. And these 3 together then, as they moved through the research and scoping, brought forward a specific project that was launched in June of 2023. And that was to move ahead with the climate related disclosures project. So number 2 on the list in front of you today. And that was not to say that climate is the only element that you'd look to in sustainability, but it was more to say climate first and not climate only. So setting out the real urgency that existed in needing climate action, bringing public sector entities into delivering on that climate action and ambition, but still being very conscious of the broader sustainability landscape and the way in which public sector entities need to reflect on it as well. And what we did then is the board moved really quickly. If you look at international standard setting and the pace of delivery and change that you'd often see with international boards, moved to an exposure draft from that launch June 2023 to the ED that we're talking about today, which was approved by the board in September of 2024 and then launched through the IPSASB channels the following month, and also accompanied by an in-person launch event in London, England in late October of 2024. And we're now today in the consultation period for this exposure draft, and that is itself running from the end of October until the end of February. So we're moving our way towards more of the tail end of this consultation period. But this is a really important opportunity for us with this global webinar and for the written responses that Karen and I will be diligently reviewing very soon, to bring all of the insights from across the global community to help us move from this exposure draft towards a final pronouncement, and with the ambition of that being within this calendar year. Now, when we moved to this specific project, there was also acknowledgement that there is the importance of dealing with some issues that came up from the previous consultation. And so just to give you a kind of sense of some of these, one was looking at the need for the development of sustainability expertise for the IPSASB. And of course, the board had been setting financial reporting standards for the last 25 plus years. And there's a very well developed network and a depth of expertise in the area of financial reporting. But understandably, there was a need to build up both network and expertise in the area of sustainability for the board and its staff. Alongside that, there was a very strong call through the consultation to not start from a blank piece of paper, and instead, in developing public sector sustainability reporting guidance, to look to adapt what already existed for the private sector, the importance of maintaining alignment for that, but also to support the speed of delivery and trying to address the urgency that we see. And then finally, ones that you'll hear from Karen shortly, another key consideration that came through in the consultation was the need to focus on the dual role of the public sector. So acknowledging that there are unique features for public sector entities that sit beyond the typical private sector disclosures that we're seeing coming through in the landscape, and thinking about how the board would best address those through public sector specific guidance. But I'll leave that to Karen in just a moment. But let me talk through for you this first area of key consideration that we heard from the consultation, and that was on the need to build up this sustainability expertise from the IPSASB itself, its staff, and through its broader network as well. And in doing that, the IPSASB has developed a set of different support groups or fora as well that are feeding in insights to help with the standard setting process. Now, the first of these is the Sustainability Reference Group. And the SRG, as we often call it, has brought together a really esteemed group of institutions and experts that you can see listed on the left-hand side of the slide in front of us. And the group has been really instrumental in providing high-level advice on the sustainability strategy of the IPSASB, as well as the work program that is being, well, at this point undertaken, but also developed, considering the future projects that might take place for the board. And alongside that, not just at the strategic level, but the SRG has had consideration of the project's technical issues that have been coming up as the IPSASB has taken on this new work program in the sustainability space. They provided some excellent advice in that area, as well as providing some views on the adoption and implementation of potential sustainability reporting standards fit for the public sector. Now, alongside the SRG, the IPSASB also established a climate topic working group. And this topic working group is focused specifically on SRS ED1. So it's looking at the climate-related disclosures and convening a set of international and national standard setters who are themselves thinking about climate-related disclosures and the reporting that's required. So you'll see it represented here IPSASB, also the GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative, and then a set of national standard setters who are making substantial progress in the area of climate disclosure for the public sector. And that is then supported by the IPSASB chair and another IPSASB board member. And of course, in that group, we're able to then bring together some really useful practical experience on sustainability standards and considering how we would then set an evolution for those for the public sector at an international level. So that's been a really important working group as well. And then finally, the IPSASB has established and launched a sustainability implementation forum. And this is, of course, it's more of a novel initiative by the IPSASB. It's not something that's been done on the financial reporting side up till now. But I think a really important innovation that's being experimented with by the IPSASB to be able to engage with preparers and users of sustainability information across the public sector, and to use that open forum to be able to bring in the preparer insights to help the board in its deliberations at this point from moving from an exposure draft towards a final pronouncement. And of course, in moving towards a final pronouncement, it's really important that the board is conscious and always considering the needs of both preparers and users. So considering what would make this implementable, if you'd like. And that's something where we've launched the Sustainability Implementation Forum in November of 2024, so late last year. And we have the first substantive meeting of the SIF participants, of the implementation leaders that are coming together in just a few weeks' time. So that's going to be happening close to the end of February. If that's something that you're interested in, do feel free to reach out to Karen or myself, or even to include that in the chat in the ways in which you could participate in this community of practice of those who are making either voluntary or complying with regulatory requirements on their own sustainability reporting within the public sector. So with that, very happy to hand over to Karen for a bit to take you through more of the key proposals relating to this climate-related disclosures ED, and then I'll come back to you just later on for some final slides before we open up for discussion. So with that, over to you, Karen.
Thanks, Alex. So let's go back to some of the other issues that are respondents to the consultation paper raised. And one of the key issues that they highlighted was that we had to build on private sector guidance, that there was a need to adapt private sector guidance to make it applicable for the public sector. And a lot of respondents agreed that there was definitely this need for public sector standards. And if I can answer a comment in the chat right now, there's one question on why we're focusing on the public sector, and that's because at the IPSASB we develop standards for the public sector. And so a lot of respondents told us that it was important that we develop our public sector standards building on private sector guidance. And this was for a number of reasons. First, it allows the public sector to maintain access to capital markets. And this was important because, as you know, sustainability reporting has been developing very quickly in the private sector. And very soon, a lot of investors will demand a similar level of information across the public and private sectors. So in order to continue to access this critical investments from the capital markets, it's important that the public sector start to have reporting that is of a similar level to that of the public sector to enable the public sector to continue to access this critical investment that's needed for our climate action. And another reason why this was important that we build on private sector guidance is that it enhances the consistency and understanding of information across different sectors. And that's because the more consistent this information is between the private and the public sectors, the more useful and more understandable this information is as people and users start building capacity and start building understanding, knowledge on the information that is being disclosed. So for example, let's think about your emissions. So your emissions will probably be integrated into someone else's value chain, someone else's scope 3 and their downstream or upstream value chain emissions. So once we have a greater alignment of reporting principles between the public and the private sectors, this will mean that there will be an enhanced data availability, more data accuracy, and also will facilitate efficient data sharing. And then another point that we got from our consultation on why we should build on private sector guidance was that this would enable the IPSASB to deliver this public sector climate-related disclosure standard as soon as possible. Now, this is really important because a lot of our stakeholders told us that this is a matter that is urgent and critical for the public sector to address now. So rather than developing bespoke standards that are completely new for the public sector, a lot of respondents told us that it was urgent and that there was a need for us to deliver the standard with haste. And this also enables us really to learn from a lot of what the private sector has done and learn from a lot of their adoption and implementation journey. But what a lot of respondents also told us is that these private sector guidance cannot fully address the full role and the multifaceted nature of the public sector. And something that we got from our consultation was that the public sector has this unique dual role that is important and critical for the public sector because it has the ability through its sovereign powers to influence the decisions or behaviors of other entities and individuals through its powers to set policies and also to set regulations. And therefore, the IPSASB decided that to address this dual role of the governments, we would leverage private sector standards to an extent. So drawing from the IPSASB's global baseline and also incorporating that multi-stakeholder approach from the GRI. So really taking a lot of that very useful private sector guidance and building on that, adding our extra context to address this dual role of the public sector. And so let's move on to talk about this unique dual role of governments. And we started off by looking at the fundamental role that governments play in climate action. And there was a question that I saw in the Q&A that might relate to this, and that is on how we contribute to these international climate targets. And the IPSASB, we looked at these international climate targets, the UN SDGs and the Paris Agreement. We recognize that these are important existing international agreements that a lot of governments around the world have already made. And these really set the background and the foundation for our standard. And they represent a collective commitment on governments on climate action. But they don't just apply to the public sector alone. They extend to the entire economy. So when a government makes this commitment, it influences both public corporations, private corporations, and extending to nonprofit organizations, households, and even individuals. And therefore, the IPSASB identified throughout this multifaceted nature of the public sector that there were two key perspectives on where the public sector would interact with climate-related issues. So on the left of this diagram, we have disclosures about an entity's day-to-day activities. So I'll refer to this from now as own operations, which are, in our standard, are aligned with the private sector's, with IFRS S2 private sector guidance. And these disclosures would address the day-to-day activities of public sector entities, such as the activities to run schools or to run hospitals. So really, a part of the disclosures of that are very central to the entity's day-to-day operations. And on the right is another perspective on how a public sector entity would interact with climate-related issues, and that's through exercising its sovereign powers to influence entities and other individuals through public policy programs. And the IPSASB has developed new guidance, specific guidance to address this unique public sector context. And we decided that this was necessary to address the unique role of the public sector. And here were the disclosure requirements ask for disclosures about an entity's climate-related public policy programs. And this is something that is not covered by private sector guidance. Now, I'll delve into these in a few slides, but then my next question to you is that do you agree that disclosures about public policy programs is needed given the nature of the public sector's policy role? see a very quick answer here. Yes.
A quick yes. I think also, Karen, worth noting in our Q&A area, we've had Anna Pinto come in, really making a similar point to what you've just shared around public policy programs, that public sector will often be acting as a regulator, a lawmaker, and that the private sector standards, the guidance for the private sector is going to be sufficient in terms of covering this particular area. So good to see that coming through in the Q&A area as well.
Yeah, definitely. And if you answer no here, we'll have another slide after this where you can share your views. So would really appreciate if you start thinking about um, your reasons for why there wouldn't be a need for disclosures about public policy programs. All right, I'll move on to the next slide. So if you voted no just now, we would really love to hear some of your views on this.
The fairly small group that would need to respond there, because I think, did it close off about 2-3%
Yeah.
saying that? So yeah, we might just be waiting for
All right.
a couple people.
So we'll move on to the next slide, which is an overview of our draft standard. And here's an illustration that makes the structure very clear, and it shows how we've been building on the global baseline on the IFRS S2 private sector guidance. Because if you're familiar with this and familiar with the TCFD framework, you'll see that we're still using that 4 pillars of governance, strategy, risk management, and also metrics and targets throughout our standard. And this is applied through own operations and also public policy programs. And what I would highlight here is for our own operations, we've, on top of the alignment with S2 private sector guidance, we've also provided public sector context to reflect the unique role of the public sector. So for example, we've put an emphasis, instead of an entity's prospects, we've changed that into the long-term fiscal sustainability of an entity. And for public policy programs, we've mostly developed public sector context that is entirely new and will address that unique public policy role of the public sector. And for appendices B and C, we've taken from the IFRS S1 because that will provide us with the conceptual foundations, general requirements, and also qualitative characteristics, which we'll elaborate on further during this presentation. Now, if you look at this, we've really taken that core structure from the IFRS S2, and a lot of our own operations are aligned and building on the IFRS S2 private sector guidance. So my next question to you is that, do you agree with how the IPSASB is proposing to align disclosures with IFRS S2 private sector guidance? And if you disagree, you'll have a chance on the next slide to provide your reasoning. I think this brings us back to our discussions just now on what our respondents told us, on why it was important to build off private sector guidance, to maintain access to capital markets, to enhance the consistency and understanding of information as we start building capacity towards climate across organizations, and also enabling the IPSASB to deliver the standard as soon as possible.
Interesting to see there's actually, just in percentage terms, a higher level support, Karen, on the public policy programs.
Yeah.
For this group than what we see here for alignment to IFRS S2. So it'll be fascinating to see in a moment then the written responses from that group, because that should be, at the moment, I would guess that's probably about 6 or 7 people who've said no, they disagree. Really good good to see the perspectives or views that set that out in more detail.
Yeah, I agree. And we have a really diverse group here. We have a lot of people who are in the other category. I maybe a lot of you from academia, from consultancies, or people just working on the environment. So great to hear your views. Elaborate on the sustainability context, public sector context. So this is something that I would say for own operations, um, we add that extra public sector context that would otherwise not be in private sector guidance. So, for example, for private sector guidance, a lot of them refer to businesses or to an entity's prospects. But these, the IPSASB decided, do not apply to the public sector. And so we've tried to address these through an entity's operations and also through its long-term fiscal sustainability. So it's really for own operations, I'd say it's really these small changes that still keep those principles but make them applicable for the public sector.
I think one useful way to talk about that, Karen, was actually a previous iteration of IFRS S2 when they were at exposure draft phase. They talked about enterprise value as a key concept within the suite of standards. They moved over and focused on prospects, the final pronouncement. But that as a concept, if you think about the protection of enterprise value, the ability to create cash flows, improve your financial position into the long term, that sits somewhat at odds with the public sector context that we're focused on. And I think it's some really useful, just slight change in language and focus that you see coming through in the transposition of IFRS S2 that's focused much more on service delivery instead, so the provision of public services and on the long-term financial sustainability of the public sector entity instead. So that's a
I
useful bit of context there.
Yeah, I see a comment on useful on that it's useful to build on IFRS S2, but then it doesn't fully capture the unique role of public sector. And I think that view is very consistent with our view at the SASB, and that's why we will, for alignment purposes, for interoperability and driving entities towards the right direction, we'll be building on the IFRS S2 while providing that additional disclosures to address the public sector. And there's also a few comments on materiality, which Alex will delve into in a moment. I know we have a very diverse group here, so we'll get a lot of different comments on materiality, depending on your experiences with materiality.
Maybe Karen, I think you're probably about to move on, but there's
Yeah.
these are always really important prompts that we see here in the Q&A, where we have Thomas saying, what is S2 and PS? Please write whole. So I think, so PS in our context, we're talking about public sector then. And I know Karen and I, we're both saying S2 a lot, but that relates to IFRS S2. So this is the standard that's been issued by the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, who have their two inaugural standards, which is IFRS S1, which is the general disclosure requirements, and then IFRS S2, which is the climate-related disclosures. So I hope that's a useful bit where we might be falling into just common language for us, but that's a
Yeah.
good check for us to make sure that we're bringing everyone with us.
Yep. I hope we're not using too much acronyms, but S2 we do in general refer to as private sector guidance. And now let's take a closer look at the disclosures about an entity's own operations. And here we're asking for an entity to disclose climate-related risks and opportunities that could affect its day-to-day activities. And we expect this portion of disclosures to be applicable for all public sector entities because we expect all public sector entities to have their day-to-day operations. And we propose here a structure that is aligned with the 4 pillars of the TCFD and the IFRS 2. So aligned with the pillars of the private sector guidance, while also providing some additional application guidance to explain how it might apply in the public sector context. So again, public sector context here, but then that's adding that additional change that really defines the difference between the private and the public sector. And so here, on the right, we have a quick high-level overview of the 4 pillars. So governance will relate to the disclosures on the oversight and management to monitor and oversee climate-related risks and opportunities. Second pillar, strategy, will include an entity's strategy and decision making, and the climate resilience of its strategy and operational model, and also the current and anticipated financial effects. Third pillar on risk management, we'll be looking for an entity's risk management processes and policies to identify, assess, and prioritize and manage its climate-related risks and opportunities. And the fourth pillar is metrics and targets, where the entity is required to disclose its performance indicators and targets it uses to measure its scopes 1, 2, and 3 greenhouse gas emissions. But maybe I can explain a bit more on that not public sector context here, is that one of the major changes we've made to make this suitable for the public sector is that the SRS ED1 proposes that entities for metrics and targets and for measuring, disclosing greenhouse gas emissions, that entities are not required to use the greenhouse gas protocol. So there is a rebuttable presumption that entities will use the greenhouse gas protocol, but then they may also use another established methodology, because understanding that a lot of public sector entities actually might have established methodologies that are aligned with their own jurisdictional regulations and also with national commitments. And moving on, the other perspective on climate-related public policy programs. So this is the other part of our disclosures are only applicable to entities who are responsible for a climate-related public policy program. Now, let me explain on climate-related public policy program a bit. So this is any public policy program, such as a law or a regulation, that has a primary objective to achieve climate-related outcomes. Now, the IPSASB had a lot of deliberations on this, on how wide the scope of public policy programs should be, but we decided that it was a practical consideration that we ask for entities to disclose only on public policy programs that have a primary objective to achieve climate-related outcomes. And so let's do a high-level overview of these 4 pillars, which are similar to own operations, are aligned with the 4 pillars in the private sector guidance. So in governance, an entity would provide disclosures on their governance processes, controls, and procedures that they use to oversee the implementation, development, and the results of climate-related public policy programs. The next pillar on the strategy is where an entity would provide disclosures on its strategy and decisions in designing and developing the climate-related public policy programs, such as what were the factors that you had to consider in setting that climate-related public policy program, and also what are the anticipated challenges that may impede the achievements of your intended outcomes of the program, and also what are the funding and future costs of that public policy program. And the next pillar is on risk management, is where the entity would provide disclosures on how it manages these challenges that it sees to achieving those intended outcomes of its climate-related policy programs. And the last pillar is on metrics and targets, where we're asking for entities to provide disclosures on the metrics that it uses to monitor the outcomes of climate-related policy programs. So that's such as the change in greenhouse gas emissions that are reasonably attributable to the climate-related policy programs. And we're also asking for its progress towards its targets. So a very quick example here is, for example, if a Ministry of Transport decides to implement a electric vehicle subsidy program with a primary objective to support the transition towards a lower carbon economy, then that falls under our definition of a climate-related policy program. So the entity would have to make its disclosures about this program under these four pillars, under our disclosure requirements. So for example, its disclosures would include what governance bodies are overseeing this program. What were the objectives of the program? And what were the factors in its decisions to set this electric vehicle subsidy program? And what are the financial implications of the program? And also, what is the impact on greenhouse gas emissions? What's the change in greenhouse gas emissions that are reasonably attributable to the program? And this is really important because it shows users whether the program is actually achieving its intended outcomes or whether it's only claiming to be a climate-related policy program. So for this specific program, these disclosures would show whether these electricity sources have actually transitioned to renewable energy, whether they're promoting this electrical vehicle subsidy program, but they're still using non-renewable energy. And also whether there have been significant increases in emissions as a result of the program, such as from increased lithium mining, for example. So these disclosures really can give users a good understanding about the policy program and whether it's achieving its intended outcomes. Now, moving on, this is an example on when an entity would have to disclose climate-related policy programs. So the first example is when an entity executes and complies with the climate-related policy program. And that's, for example, when a Ministry of Transport, under a jurisdiction-wide climate policy, converts its fleet of buses into electric vehicles. And this would form a part of its own operations. And the second example, in green, is when an entity is responsible for the outcomes of a climate-related policy program, which is when a Ministry of Environment designs a climate-related policy program, and it also has the responsibility for the outcomes of the program. And therefore, it would provide disclosures about its own operations and also for climate-related policy programs. So I hope that this makes it clear when an entity executes and complies with a broader policy program, it would be a part of its own operations. But when it is responsible for the outcomes of the program, then it would have to provide disclosures on the program.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Karen, for taking us through some of those key considerations within the exposure draft. I think really great to have the specific examples that you're citing to help everyone in understanding some of the details of the ED. I'd like to move us on now to focus on some of the conceptual foundations that are found within IPSASB SRS ED1. And the first and a really important one of these actually was coming through some of the Q&A questions, focuses on materiality. And this is an area that for those who have been following the debates, discussions, thought pieces on sustainability reporting, you'll have heard a lot about materiality over the last few years. And this is one that I'd want to maybe start by just giving some confidence to everyone who's joining today that there was considerable deliberation by the IPSASB, by the board members, reflecting on this specific point of material information and what should be disclosed. And that discussion ranged from the kind of the full range of what we hear in discussing materiality. So the terms like financial materiality, double materiality, impact materiality, dynamic materiality, to name a few. But in undertaking the IPSASB's deliberations, and with advice from the IPSAS board's sustainability reference group, the ultimate view was that the ED, so looking at SRS ED1, that it should be relying on the existing conceptual framework from the IPSASB. And this would then mean that we have a focus on a set of primary users who are service recipients and resource providers, and providing information that's useful to those primary users. And what this means is that we actually end up with a broader multi-stakeholder approach that goes beyond what is typically the investor perspective when we look at the IFRS S2 standard, and is then aligned more to the public sector context and what's going to be required for public sector sustainability reporting. This would also mean, if we're focusing on this definition of materiality within the IPSASB conceptual framework, that there are certain objectives of reporting, assessing what is material information. And that's that it should be supporting users in evaluating information for decision making and for accountability purposes. And I think that's a useful lens by which preparers can reflect on what is material information that they need to report to their users of the general purpose financial reports and of the sustainability information. And another important element of this is reflecting on connectivity. So that's connectivity between the sustainability reports and the broader general purpose financial reports, and the financial statements as well. So seeing that connectivity and alignment between the definitions is of course of great value, but also in then demonstrating the connected information that you'll see in the bottom right of the slide in front of us, to make sure that we do have disclosure that provides information to primary users that allows them to understand those connections between different sets of information. So if that's their climate related disclosures, if that's their financial statements, or if it's looking across other general purpose financial reports. Now you'll also see on this slide two other elements here. One of those is, maybe I may work my way up, is looking at the reporting entity. And the expectation within the exposure draft is that the reporting entity would be the same as for the financial statements. So again, one where we'd see alignment between both the sustainability reporting and the financial reporting. And the other expectation that comes through, and this is something you'll find within the appendices, is that there's a need to have fair representation, faithful representation of information, and that's that the information is complete, neutral, and free from material error in a manner that is relevant, understandable, timely, comparable, and verifiable. And these are concepts that are, I think, really useful in setting these conceptual foundations of sustainability reporting in the public sector. But I'd like to spend just another moment with everyone talking about the steps that are included within the ED on determining material information. So you'll see this three-step model on the slide in front of us that starts with step one of understanding the entity's context. And this, you'll see some of the comparable or related ideas that Karen was sharing with us just a moment ago, thinking about the international agreements, the national plans that the entity might be signed up to, either by its own accord or as part of a larger network of public sector entities. And to then have consideration of the activities it's undertaking, its relationships, its own broader context. And for those of you who have been in the sustainability reporting space for some time, you might be seeing in this first step connections to GRI, to the Global Reporting Initiative, which itself says that step one in determining material information is understanding the entity's context. So that's something that is showing alignment to the GRI framework in developing SRS ED1. Once we've completed that first step in determining material information, we then move into step two, which is identifying the actual or potential outcomes and risks or opportunities. And in this case, for ED1, this is focused on identifying the climate-related risks and opportunities of the entity's own operations, but also looking at the outcomes of its own climate-related public policy programs. And I think some of the key words that we heard from Karen in this area were that it's the public policy programs the entity is responsible for that makes it fall within scope of its own reporting, and also where there's the primary purpose of addressing climate issues within the public policy program. So that there's a real control of scope that comes through this, and that's been an area of discussion as well by the board in understanding what public policy program disclosures should be required. So that brings us through to step two in identifying both these the risks and opportunities and the outcomes. The final step then is then determining the material information. So based on that broad identification of outcomes, risks, and opportunities, the entity would then determine what information is material for its primary users. And as I said to you on the previous slide, our primary users that we're focused on here are the service recipients, so individuals who are receiving public services, or the resource providers. That could be very typically your taxpayers, but it could also be grant providers. It could be parts of the international donor community who are providing resources into the public sector. And then, of course, there are materiality judgments that are going to be required in providing this information, both quantitative and qualitative perspectives that are going to be unique to each entity. So there's going to be some important professional judgment that's then applied in determining the material information. So that's given you a quick overview of some of those conceptual foundations and the key steps to determining material information. So let's now go to the next, and maybe is it one of the last polls that we have with Slido, which is to hear from everyone on whether you agree with the approach that the IPSAS board has set out in terms of materiality for climate-related disclosures. So great to see the responses coming through quickly
So
here.
also just to add to Alex, our current approach to materiality is consistent with our own conceptual framework. So it's in our own literature, and we're aligning with our own IPSASB literature.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Okay, interesting to see the division here. So there is still a large majority of support, but it's sitting more around the 70% mark, 70 to 75% mark at the moment. So 1 in
And
4.
yeah, maybe I could add some of my own views here. It's on materiality, and I think a lot of our comments coming up on the next slide, you'll have a chance to share your reasoning, is on impact materiality, and we do cover this at the IPSASB, but to a certain extent, to outcomes of public policy programs. So we do look at how these public policy programs are impacting the economy, environment, and people.
It looks like we're coming in pretty much where we started there, Karen. So we're sitting at the same 1 in 4 coming through. So really great for those of you who did say that you disagree, if you could provide some of your thinking around what is a really important aspect of SRS ED1, and that's establishing material information and the approach to materiality. So great to see quite a few people coming in with their views here. So lots typing and showing up at the top there.
Yep.
Really interesting to see that.
More clarity around
Okay.
materiality.
Yeah, so that can actually be something that's useful actually as feedback, just in
Yeah.
terms of the board's deliberations, in terms of what support should be provided, if there's other kind of adoption implementation guidance that might be required in this space.
Yep, I think
That's
that's
itself really useful. Sorry, Karen.
a fair point. Yeah. How do you define double materiality? Is it short or not? Um,
Some other great questions coming through in that, Karen,
yes.
too. Yes. Yeah, yeah.
We do not we don't take a black and white approach to materiality. I would say the our definition of materiality really leaves it to the entity's own judgments. So the entity will, in applying our definition of materiality, will require a lot of professional judgments from their side in going through that three-step approach that Alex had explained earlier on determining what information is material for its users.
There's lots of really interesting feedback coming from this. It's good
Yeah,
that I know this, maybe just to reassure everyone too, all of the answers here are captured on the Slido system for the IPSASB. So it's not just that Karen and I are looking at this with you today,
yeah,
but all of the answers that you provide are then retained and made use of in terms of the future discussions of
yeah.
the SRG working group, SIF, and of course the IPSAS board itself.
Yeah, so I would definitely really encourage you to use the Slido so we can take it forward, we can analyze your answers and take it to the board as we go through the rest of our feedback.
Yeah, there's some really interesting items here where I'd like to actually spend more time on if we could. But I think we're going to have to continue on for the moment, really capture all of these insights. And just to say, I very much appreciate everyone's thoughts in these areas. This is going to be really useful to help inform the deliberations to come.
All right, so I'll move on to the next slide.
Excellent. So this brings us on then to the transition provisions that are included within SRS ED1. And this is something I did see. So while Wayne was doing an excellent job of presenting some of the key insights around the ED, I was looking through the Q&A, and there were a few questions that were coming through around transitional provisions. So this is the opportunity we now have to think about what transitional reliefs are provided to public sector entities who might be looking to then apply SRS ED1. So in the first annual reporting period, there are three transition reliefs that are aligned with the private sector guidance. So that's with IFRS S1 and S2. And if we look at these in turn, it's that there isn't a requirement to have comparable information in the first year. We're also allowing for a delayed timing of reporting after publishing financial statements rather than having it at the same time in that first reporting cycle. So that's your second one on the screen there, report climate-related disclosures after financial statements. So there's a 1-year transition relief on the timing of reporting. There's also a transition relief around scope 3 disclosures. So there are requirements, of course, within the ED to report on scope 1, 2, and 3 greenhouse gas emissions. And there was actually, again, Q&A questions and discussion around the different GHG reporting requirements. So it does include all 3 scopes, but scope 3, which is well known to be more complex for many entities. It's something that does take more time to prepare, to engage with the value chain, to reach out to different members of a supply chain and collect information, whether it be through activity data or through expenditure to really do the best reporting as possible. So therefore, again, we have an alignment here with IFRS S1 and S2 that the public sector entity would not be required to disclose scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions in their first reporting period. And in addition to these aligned transition reliefs, so 1, 2, and 3, there's also an additional provision that is due to our own guidance around the public sector focus that the IPSASB has offered to not require disclosure of the change in greenhouse gas emissions that's reasonably attributed to the existing climate-related public policy programs. So this is a specific relief that arises from what you've seen on the right-hand side of a previous slide from Karen, So not coming from the transposition of IFRS S2 in own operations, where we have our aligned transition reliefs, but an additional relief because of those public sector specific disclosures required under the public policy programs. And there was actually real a deliberate move by the IPSASB and its deliberations to align these transition reliefs, to have them align quite closely to private sector. Given that for many public sector entities, they're going to be collecting relevant data as part of their international or national commitments. And some of them might already be actually be reporting some of this data. And alongside that, there's just the urgency of climate action. And therefore, we wanted to, of course, include, the IPSASB was looking to include these transition reliefs, but to make sure that the full standard is coming in at pace alongside the expectations that we were hearing from stakeholders from previous consultations. So there you go. This is the overview then of the transition reliefs that are included within SRS ED1. If we go on to the next slide, then you'll see our what is it, second last, I think, or third last Slido poll coming through on whether you agree with these proposed transition reliefs. It'd be really useful to capture your views here on this.
And you'll
this important area.
also have a chance to give us some other thoughts you have on transitional relief. And you could share that on our next slide.
It's good to see those responses coming quickly again. So
and there's
again, yeah, sorry, Karen, go ahead.
Sorry, go on, Alex.
Yeah. I was just saying that it looks like we're getting to a similar proportion of what we had on materiality. So it's moving towards that kind of 1 in 4 again, who are saying no. But what did you want to come in with, Karen?
No, I just want to say that there's a lot of questions from that in the Q&A. It's great to see
Yes.
a lot of activity there. If we still have time after, then we'll try to go through some of the questions and try to answer some of that, hoping that it will clarify some of your questions for you.
Okay. Well, here's a really important open question that we have here in Slido. So I have the text responses on any other reliefs that would be useful. So considering what might be unique to the public sector, where we might need to share with the board and then support their deliberations around other transition reliefs that could be useful to preparers and users. Really good to see what insights you have to share on that. See quite a few people typing their responses to the open text question here. Okay, so an extension of scope 3. So that transition relief should be longer. Yeah, I think there is the specific discussion. So someone's written onerous cost expertise. And I think that's maybe a quick way to say that there's questions around the capacity of certain public sector entities to undertake this alongside other public financial management reform, for example, and want to reflect on the board.
Yeah, and I think it also really, when we decided to align with the transitional relief as a private sector, we did go to a lot of different stakeholders, and there were definitely varying opinions. But something that we also heard from a lot of them was that a lot of governments, public sector entities, because of their international or national climate commitments, have been collecting this data for some time now. So even though there is no reporting and there's no reporting of that information, there is data availability to start with. So that was one of the reasons why we decided to go ahead to because of the urgency of the topic, as Alex has said.
There's still a few people typing there. If we give it just a moment. I'm also conscious that I want us to have as much time as we can just at the end for folks to offer their questions, for us to engage with as many of those as we can. But I think maybe in summary, as we're finishing up the typing there, a lot of people coming back on scope 3 emissions and some questions around staggering different types of transition relief. I did see some around the size of entity as well. So thinking about the capacity of maybe
Yeah,
smaller entities and what they're able to do. So that's really useful for us to take away, Karen.
yeah, definitely. I think something else that we want to add is that we're paying a very close attention to what's happening in the private sector. So I know that there have been implementation challenges, uh, and with the transition on timeline on the private sector side, and we're definitely paying a close attention to that. And that is one of the benefits I see of us aligning with private sector guidance, is that we can learn from a lot of the lessons that they've experienced there. And hopefully we can take that forward with our transition relief as well. And there was a question as well on public policies. And I just want to clarify that scopes 1, 2, and 3 would only be applicable for own operations. Public policy programs, we're asking for something else, and that is the change in greenhouse gas emissions. Now,
Good.
um,
Okay. Maybe I can speak to this one quickly first,
yeah,
Karen, but I think this is something that in many of the different engagements, the outreach that the board and its staff have been progressing over the last number of months, implementation has been a really critical area of focus. And this is one where I'd be really keen to hear from everyone here, as many participants as want to engage, on what you see as particular implementation challenges relating to SRS ED1, and maybe the ways in which we could bring some of those insights again into board deliberation and consideration of moving towards a final pronouncement and reflecting on this. Karen, do you want to come in too?
and well, I think this brings us back to one of the a slide that Alex has shared just now, and that is our expertise, our sustainability supports that are supporting us throughout the project. And that's through our sustainability implementation forum, which we've been working on for the past few months. And that is really convening a group of preparers as a community of practice to share their implementation challenges and to possibly pilot and test our whether our disclosure requirements are uh, are practical for their entity. Definitely see a lot of capacity here. I think that's definitely an issue, but I think it will become easier. It's always hard at the start, when everyone's still trying to build up that knowledge level, and that's why I think that brings us back to one of the reasons why we have to build on private sector, is that because we already have that initial capacity that's slowly starting to build on the private sector, and it's going to be easier as we move forward.
But lots of really useful responses coming through this one, Karen. One for us to go through definitely line by line to get all of these insights included. I think maybe what was standing out to me as well before we move on to the next slide was a number of respondents saying that they're concerned around the convincing of co-workers or the relevant decision makers on the adoption of these standards too, so that it's not just the kind of capacity, but also building right political will and support to move ahead the standards. That was interesting to see. Good. Excellent. Well, let's move on then to the next slide, where I think we have we're coming up to, I think this is the final time we're asking for a yes, no to everyone. And that's whether those participating today think that a public sector climate related disclosure standard would be useful in their own jurisdiction. So good that we've been talking about this in terms of the principles, the key concepts, looking at the transition reliefs, materiality, for example. But this is, I think, a really useful measure for us to take back to other discussions around whether this would be something that would be useful within your own context. Thinking about the jurisdictions of all of the different global participants that we're really privileged to have today.
And if you voted for no, or if you have other opinions on uptake in your jurisdiction, then you can share that to us in the next slide.
Great. Yeah, let's go to that one then. So this is, again, a smaller proportion of people. Yeah, so we have a few people typing on this, but I want keen that we just give you a moment to do that before we look at the final couple slides that we have for everyone.
Yeah, and we do have a great group of implementation leaders in our sustainability implementation forum, and they're representing a huge geographical representation. So it's so they'll be testing, they'll be piloting our standard for us, and hopefully they'll bring in some of your different geographical jurisdictional insights and share that with us. Hopefully we'll towards as we work towards the final pronouncements of the standard.
Yeah, definitely. The SIF will be a really important platform for bringing in those insights, Karen. Yeah, so there's legal considerations, there's capacity constraints that some are sharing. There's, yeah, the kind of building those foundations that some feel they have to do first. I did see on the previous slide too, someone was saying that they feel like there's kind of reform fatigue and challenges already with the public financial reform that some are doing and adopting and implementing IPSAS, the financial reporting standards. And I think it's worth maybe sharing with everyone too that these are a separate suite of standards. So an entity could be implementing the financial reporting standards under IPSAS and not pursuing SRS, and they would still be complying with the requirements under IPSAS, or they might be doing both, or they might be only doing the sustainability reporting standards. So these are not seen as a kind of collective requirement of all of the reporting standards that have been issued as pronouncements by the IPSASB, but they're separate suites between financial reporting, sustainability reporting, and also a separate suite of the RPGs, recommended practice guidelines. So there are these different suites, and I think it's an important consideration for entities and jurisdictions to reflect on.
And I think there's an interesting comment here on developing countries. I think it's important for us to really engage with a lot of with developing countries, and hopefully if I can answer one of the questions in the chat as well, is actually one of our considerations in our scope of public policy programs, and only requiring public policy programs that have a primary objective to achieve climate-related outcomes, is really considering the capacity of entities to disclose and look through this information, and it's definitely going to be challenging on a resource perspective if we're asking for all public policies, especially to a lot of developing economies.
Good. Right. Well, so I think, yeah, some other useful insights for us to take away on this, but I think just for time, let's move to the next, the final couple slides that we have. And this is to talk to everyone about next steps. So I did share at the top of our presentation today that we are in the consultation period at the moment, and the deadline is now fast approaching. So we have February 28th, 2025 as the deadline to receive written comments to the IPSASB. Which covers these 10 specific matters for comment that are requested for SRS ED1, though all relevant comments are, of course, welcomed and considered by the board in its deliberations. And that's something where you can go onto the IPSASB website and see the place where you're able to submit those written consultation responses that have followed on from what's coming up to the conclusion of a 120-day consultation period between October and the end of February. And once that ED comment period closes, we'll then be moving into a really important phase of the board's deliberation of moving from this exposure draft, considering any of the issues that are raised at the ED stage, to make progress towards an approved final standard. And the intention is to try to move to that within the final months of 2025, but that will very much be dependent on what what's coming back from the ED comment period. So without presupposing that, there's the ambition of looking to the end of 2025 as the point of potentially final pronouncement, but something that we'll all be hearing more about as the comment period closes and the board reflects on the different issues that are raised. So I think with that, Karen, we have around 10 minutes left in the global webinar. And 42 questions. So I'm not sure that we're going to be able to cover all of them quite, but let's bring these up. And I know for some of them, they were also issues that we were picking up as we were making our way through the presentation. So I hope some of these we can say they're well covered off already. There was one that I saw coming up on GRI, and I don't know, Karen, if you'd want to speak on this briefly, where we had someone asking what's the role of the GRI reporting standards within SRS ED1 and how the GRI is featured as public sector guidance. Oh, you're on mute, Karen. Sorry.
So GRI is definitely something that we looked at the IPSASB, and we also do have a close relationship with GRI. We have representation from GRI in our climate topic working group. But we did take a look at GRI, considered some of the factors in a GRI, and something that we found very valuable to us is their multi-stakeholder approach, as Alex has mentioned just now in our three-step materiality model. So that is where I see our biggest connection with GRI is, even though we're still building on that IPSASB baseline, but then also bringing in that multi-stakeholder approach from GRI, and really showing that holistic perspective of the public sector through GRI.
Yeah, so really good to show the kind of the broad review and analysis done by the board in developing the standard, looking to different frameworks and concepts to develop SRL ED1. Maybe another one for us to tackle here. You can pick out some as you like to. Sonia Shaw has raised a question on public policy programs. So looking to clarify, are public policy programs that are not climate related, do those need to be assessed and disclosed? So looking at the scope of disclosure there.
So for now, we're not asking for entities to disclose policy programs that do not have a primary objective to achieve climate-related outcomes. Now, this was through a lot of deliberations from the IPSASB board, and really considering that a lot of countries are still developing in their climate-related disclosures. In fact, a lot of public sector entities haven't even started climate-related disclosures yet. So, and also considering that resource constraints and capacity that a lot of you mentioned in your answers to us in the challenges towards implementation. So
Okay, I'm not sure if this is for others, but I've lost your audio now. Oh, it's back there. Sorry about that.
So yeah, what we're only asking for is disclosures on climate-related policy programs, and that is for what we're asking for now. It might change in the future, and it might develop in the future as more countries develop that capacity and resources to disclose this issue. But then if entities wish, we don't stop them from disclosing other policy programs in their reports either.
Excellent. Okay, and there's a number of questions coming through where it's an issue I dealt with briefly, but I think it's an important one to clarify, which is on the application and the relevance between the financial statements and the requirements under IPSAS, the financial reporting requirements, and the SRS, sustainability reporting standards. So there's a number of people asking whether these are sitting as a single suite standards or if they're, the sustainability reporting would then be mandatory for an entity to say that it's reporting under IPSAS. And it's, I think, important to clarify that that's not the case, that these are separate suites of standards that are being issued by the IPSASB. And that was an area of close deliberation as well. So that was very much reviewed and considered by the board in thinking about whether this would be sitting as a separate suite. And that was the decision for SRS ED1. Is there anything else you want to say on that, Karen? Because it's an important point, but one that I think is sometimes lost in
Yeah,
the discussion.
definitely. I think that that's one of the one of the deliberations that the IPSASB had at the very start of starting to work on our climate-related disclosure standard. And that's when we decided that it would be a separate suite of standards. We don't want to deter or stop entities from disclosing through our IPSASB SRS. And that's why we've developed a separate suite of standards with the IPSAS that is now branded as the IPSASB SRS Sustainability Reporting Standards.
All right, so I'm just doing other responses in the chat there. Is there anything that you wanted to pull out as well, Karen? Anything that the short time that we have left?
I'm trying to go through some of the questions. I see some asking for material. This will be uploaded on our YouTube channel, so you can always go back, review it. But we also will have a lot of material on our websites in other languages as well. If you speak French, our ED is translated into French, and we have some brochures that are translated into Spanish or Arabic that are available on the IPSASB's website. So there's a lot of information on there. There's also an at-a-glance document and a webcast that is available on our website, also with the full ED, and you'll be able to get more information out of that in formulating your comments to the IPSASB.
I can see our IFAC colleagues have very kindly put in the chat a link to that YouTube channel. So if you're able to access all of that excellent content. And maybe just a quick closing question for us, Karen, because this is, I think, a good way to kind of bring our heads up and look to the future on the work program for sustainability reporting. We have someone asking here, are there plans by the IPSASB to continue developing further guidance, templates, best practice examples for public sector entities to think about their own disclosures in the area of sustainability reporting? So I know that's one that you've been diligently working on recently.
Best practice examples, we don't have that yet because we're still working on towards the final pronouncement of the standard. But what we do have is the Sustainability Implementation Forum, which hopefully will bring us, we have a great group of preparers there, as I said, and hopefully that will bring us some great examples on entities that are either trying to do a gap analysis with our standard or doing a full run of reporting with the SRS ED. So hopefully we'll get some examples from there, which will be useful for the future and for wider implementation as well.
Yes, and I think in addition to that, Karen, there's also board deliberation thinking about any future sustainability reporting projects that might come into the work program. But that's still at the early stages at the moment, but it is very much on the radar of the board as well.
All right, I think we're
I think we are, yeah, unfortunately coming to time in this, but these are all, there's lots of different comments that have come through in the Q&A as well, different ideas, questions for Karen and I to reflect on, and also to take back to future board deliberations. So can I close by really encouraging everyone to fully engage with this ED consultation process? So there aren't too many weeks left now until the consultation period's closing. And we are looking for a really broad level of engagement to develop the highest quality sustainability reporting standard possible that can be fit for the public sector. So that remains for me to then say thank you very much, everyone, for joining today. It's been a great level of engagement that we've received. Lots for us all to reflect on. I hope you have a wonderful day. Take care, everyone.
thanks all.